Today I want to talk to you about how to color grade your footage, and specifically using features found inside of the color page called power windows. Now, if you haven't used these before, they can really take your color grading to the next level and allow you to get a very cinematic look to your footage. Let's jump right in. Let's say we have a piece of footage here. I'm going to bring this one down. It's just a guy looking out the window, checking out the neighborhood. I don't know what he's looking at, but he's got a little bit of light coming in. It's sort of a daylight shot, and he looks suspicious of something that's happening in the area. But let's say we wanted to change the feel of this and get a different mood to it. What we'd want to do is go over to the color page, and you can see I have that one clip selected. If you had a larger project that had more clips than that, there would be more clips right across here, and you'd be able to select the ones that you wanted to work on just by clicking on them and getting them surrounded in red. Now, if you don't see your clips here right above your color wheels, go to the upper left and make sure you have clips turned on. If you have this off, you won't be able to see them. Just click that little icon and it'll turn those on. Now we begin with one node, and I know these whole color nodes can be a little confusing. We've talked about them a little bit on the channel, but not a lot. We've worked with nodes in Fusion where I explained it was a bit like putting an effect pedal in line between your guitar and your amplifier. This is kind of the same thing here in the color page, but the nodes work a little bit different than the Fusion page, but still think of it in terms of every node you add is like adding another layer on top of the original video footage. Now, as always, we have sort of our single node here that we start with whenever we come into the color page and have a clip selected. And I've seen people use nodes all different ways, and I'm still sort of learning which way I like using them. My gut instinct says, well, why don't I just reach down here and start color correcting and changing things around the way that I want them to look instead of adding more nodes? Why do I need more nodes? Why can't I just use this one? And what you start to learn the more you do some color correcting is that if you try to get everything to happen at once, it's almost a bit like cooking. Do you ever look at a recipe and it's got a whole list of ingredients that have to go together? Well, if you just took all the ingredients and stuffed them in a bowl and whipped them all together and put that in the oven, it may not come out exactly like it should. The same way with any recipe, there's sort of an order of when to put certain things in for certain reasons because they affect the eventual outcome. And that's a bit like what these color nodes do. You're just building a recipe one ingredient at a time, and if you put them all together at once, could be problematic. Sometimes just using one node and color correcting is all you need, but in this instance, I'm going to use several just so we can sort of see the building out process of using more than one color node. So this very first node, I'm just going to leave as the original color. If you just noticed here, I had played around with the color. Right down here, there's a reset. If you ever want to go back to the starting point, you can just click that and it'll reset all of the color changes you've made. But I'm going to start by right-clicking on this node, and I'm going to scroll down to add node, and I'm going to add a serial node. A serial node you would think would be a bowl of Captain Crunch with some milk in it. Surprisingly, it's not. Serial just means that it's going to be in line one after another. So when I did that, it just inserted another serial node in line right after the first. Almost like adding another effects pedal to your guitar rig. Now with that node selected, you see how it's surrounded in red right there? What I'm going to do is I'm going to use this node to just set the exposure. This is a little bit harsh. This is sort of a very crisp, clear image, and I want to get a little more cinematic with it. So what I'm going to do is go down to this curves window right here, make sure that's selected, and I'm just going to grab this low dot and bring it up a little bit, grab that higher dot over there and bring it down. Now I have the parade scope selected over on the right. That's kind of one of my favorite scopes to use because it just makes a lot of sense to my brain. I've talked about exactly how that works in a previous video. If you haven't seen it, I'll make sure I link it down below so you can watch that as well and give you a little more information to get up to speed. But when we're looking at these custom curves here, all of this stuff down here, if I left click, hold, and grab that dot and just move my mouse up and down, you can see that this is moving the lowest parts of the light spectrum, what your eye can see, and raising those darks up to make them lighter or bringing it down to make them darker. So I'm going to try to bring it up just to give it a little more of a open exposure. And the opposite is true up here too. If you see that dot up here, those reds, greens, and blues are really pinned out very high to the top. So I'm going to drop them back just a little bit and just sort of lose some of that top end. Now there's a trick that I've seen people do where they create this exposure curve by adding a few more points in this graph here. Just left click, you can add a point. I'm going to go right where that spike is, just a little bit to the right. Add a point and drag it down just a little bit. If I dragged it a lot, you can see what it's doing. It's bringing those darks way down, and you can see in the scope, it's sort of grabbing the lower mids and squashing them down into the darks. I'm just going to bring it down just a little bit. I just want to bring that down a tiny bit, And I'm going to add another dot a little bit higher and then just stretch that up slightly. So I have a slight S-curve right here. And what that does is just slightly changes the exposure to give it a slightly more cinematic look. How many times can I say slightly today? I think that was 6. If you ever want to check what the changes you're doing look like against the original, you can go right up just to the upper right above your preview window and click on this little icon right here and it'll shut the color grading off. And as you can see, it just did a slight change to sort of open up the exposure a bit so it's not quite as heavy contrast. And I'm going to rename this node, and I can do that by right-clicking on it and choosing Node Label. And I'm going to start typing. If you see there's a little flashing line above the node, I'm going to call this my exposure, so that if I ever look at the node later on, I'll know what each one is doing. So that's my exposure node, and I'm going to right-click on that and add another serial node next to it. Now you'll see right here from the window, it actually shows you the shortcuts to the right of it. So if you ever don't want to be right-clicking and trying to find the thing, you can learn these shortcuts. They're different between different operating systems, so they may not be the same on Mac as they are in PC. So I'll always show you the feature first, and then you guys can figure out if you want to use the shortcut. So I'm going to grab and add another serial node right here. And this time I'm going to use this one to create the color that I want. I'm going to change the color of this clip a bit. Let's do the same thing. Right-click, choose Node Label, and I'm going to call this color just so I know that that will be the color that I'm changing on this particular clip. And I want this to feel a little more moody. So I'm going to start by changing some of the high end right over into the blues a bit. I'm going to pull it a little bit blue. I'm going to grab some of the mids and pull them a little bit more into the blue as well. And then I'm going to grab the offset, the overall, and grab that and bring that slightly blue, just slightly. You can see how it changes the different parts of the spectrum over in the scopes. The blue sort of gives that feeling of a little darker or a little later into the evening. So pulling blue does good things there. Now I don't want to just pull the whole thing blue. It'll look like he's underwater. He's got a blue filter on the lens. So I definitely want to keep like the lows where they are. You'll notice that each one of these wheels has its own reset right above it. So I can reset just the lows by clicking that. I want it a little bit more cinematic, and I'll move around till I find something I like, maybe this a little more greenish blue in the highs. And these are just slight changes I'm making here. I'm just doing very slight modifications using this primary's color wheels. So there's my color and there's my exposure. And as you can see, if we go back to the original, that was a much more heavily contrasted feel with a lot more daylight. Now we've been able to change the exposure and change the color a bit, so it's feeling a little more like into the evening or a little darker, a little more ominous. It still feels like there's light coming from weird places that aren't doing what I want it to do for this sort of ominous effect I'm leaning into. So let's do this again. Let's right-click on the color node and add another serial node after that one. But in this one, we're going to do something a little different. We're going to use power windows, which is a feature I've talked about here on the channel, but not as much as I would like to. So I want to make sure we really get into these today. Now with that new node selected, go down here and you can see we're on the curves icon. That's that curves window in the middle that we were changing some of the exposure and creating that S-curve with. But you can go over to here and you'll see window. Click on that icon, and these are power windows. Think of these almost like masks within your footage. Now, I'm sure a lot of you have used masks to do things like cut out a person and remove the background, but these power windows work a little bit different than that. There's a square mask that if you click on it, it actually puts a square, like a rectangle, right up on your screen. If you click it again, it'll go away. There's a round one that gives you more of a circle. There is this line one here that gives you a little more of a freeform shape that you can move around. The difference between this one here and this one up above it, you'll see in a little bit when I show you some of the feathering techniques. There's a pen tool where you can physically draw any kind of power window that you want. Just make sure you connect it at the end so that it'll be a complete circle or shape. If you don't go all the way back to the beginning, you won't get this sort of center handle. And it won't do the thing you want it to do. You'll be trying to change colors and things and thinking, why isn't my mask working? Why isn't my power window working? Then it's because you didn't quite go back and click that very first dot again. And the last one you've got here is sort of a gradient. And what it does is it works in directions. It's got a line and an arrow. And I'm going to use that one for this particular grade. I'm just left clicking and holding and grabbing the arrow, and you can see it sort of has a rotate, and it's moving that arrow. I can move it in any direction or stretch it out. I think a lot of you may know what a gradient is. We use it a lot of times with color images where we might be in Photoshop or whatever photo software you use, and you want to have something sort of change color across the picture. Maybe you want the left to be green and fade into a blue. That's sort of a gradient, meaning it's doing something over the course of the picture from one direction to the next. Maybe top to bottom, bottom to top, left to right. But this power window allows us to do that with light, with color, with anything we want. And because he's looking out a window, I actually want to come over here, put that somewhere in the window and bring it back towards like his face. I'm going to stretch a little bit past. And it's almost a bit of a downward shape. If you look, see how the light source in the background sort of going down by his arm? So I'm going to actually steer it down just a little bit, raise it up here. And then what I'm going to do, I'm going to go down to the color wheels, the primaries color wheels, and I'm going to grab the gamma, those mids, and I'm going to crank them up a bit just by grabbing that wheel at the very bottom and turning it to the right. Then can you see how this sort of gets brighter in here? If I go really heavy, you'll see how white that gets. I actually want to go the opposite way, and here's why. If you look at this, the entire window seems very bright to me, up in the left and everything else, and I want to make it feel a little later in the evening, so just maybe the street light might be coming through the window and catching his face, but not necessarily the entire sun lighting up the whole window. What I'm going to do here is grab that gamma, the mids that really bring out a lot of the mid-tone brightness, left click on that wheel and drag it back and watch what happens. Do you see how it sort of darkens up everything up in that area? It doesn't affect as much in that lower right. I could drag it and pull it that way, and the more I pull it, it pulls that color grading with it. I really want it back here where it's mostly stopping just past his face. And if I move this around, you'll kind of see it change. Do you see that gradient moving with it? When I keep it back here, we only get just sort of the upper corner being darker. And when I bring it way down here, it kind of comes with me. I want it maybe right in about here, just so the upper left is a little darker. Now, I do have to take a second to thank our sponsors today, our good friends at Blackmagic Design, the makers of DaVinci Resolve, and also the people who provided the footage we're using here today, Storyblocks. Storyblocks is an affordable asset house where you can get things like B-roll, music, sound effects, and images that you can use royalty-free in your next YouTube video. And Storyblocks just added an entire section of templates specifically for DaVinci Resolve that include animated titles, transition, motion graphics, and more. Now, I've been using Storyblocks for years before they ever became a sponsor, because I actually really like the quality of the product they offer. I also like the fact that for one affordable price, you can get access to as many assets as you need. There are no download limits about how many videos that you can use at any given time period, how many images you can use, or how many pieces of music or sound effects that you can get from Storyblocks. I'll leave a link down below if you want to go check out Storyblocks for yourself today. Now, I also want sort of this lower left to be darker as well. Now, I could simply just add another color node, and then I could do a similar thing with the arrow pointing the other way using that gradient. But here's a cool trick I just want to show you so you know it. This one here, this node, has this power window in it, pulling back the gain up in the upper left and feathering off to the lower right. If I wanted to create a node that was the inverse of that did the opposite, what I could do is I could actually right-click on it, go down to Add Node again, and I could do Add Outside. What that does is it creates another node that sort of affects everything in the opposite way. Let me give you a better example with something that might make a little more sense. Now, if I had a circle, I could right-click and I could add a serial node that does the opposite. It's now affecting everything outside of the circle. And if I grab the offset and bring it up, you'll see it brings everything up with it. Or if I grab the gain, it would do that too. So it's doing the opposite of whatever the power window in the previous node did. Just a cool little trick to know sometimes. Let me delete that node and also let me get rid of this power window I don't need. I only want this one on right here, that gradient coming down. But let me do the opposite. Let me right click and let me go add node, and I'm going to add the outside. And now in this node, I'm going to grab the gamma again. I'm going to pull it way back. And can you see what's happening over at sort of at the bottom of his shirt here? As I pull that back, it's doing the opposite of what the previous node did. It's taking everything in the lower right and making it dark. It's pushing it the opposite direction. It's almost like I had another gradient power window in there spinning around and going the opposite way. Kind of cool though, huh? Now I can sort of take down the gamma, and I can even take down some of the brights right down in that corner. And what it'll do is it'll make that back corner down here by his shirt just a little darker. As you can see, every time I do something in a node, it affects the overall output of the image. But the great thing of having all these different nodes separated for like exposure, color, the gradient, is that I can go back and adjust each one independently, and it gives me a lot more control of the overall final clip and the final color grading. While I'm here, why don't I just go ahead and label these nodes? I'm going to call this one gradient, and then I'm going to right click node label, and I'm going to call this other one reverse gradient, just so I know what they are. It's not that you have to label every one of these nodes, but when you start using a lot of them in a particular color grading or color correction, it's easy to forget what each one of these things are doing, or at least it is for me, and I need every bit of help to keep me on track as much as possible along the way. So we can see this is starting to get darker. It's starting to feel a little bit more like nighttime. Again, if I go up here and I hit the bypass button, this is the original footage. And if I turn it back on, you can see we've gone for a much darker thing. Now I like what's going on, but the overall exposure might be a little dark now that I've added these other things. And here's where I can go back to the original exposure node grade, and I can decide to bring that whole thing up a little bit. It can help me lighten this entire clip up and get it to where I want it to be. I'm also noticing over here on the scopes as I bring this up in the exposure, it's sort of getting clipped up at the top. There's a way to soften some of that too. If you click back on the curves, you can go back over, and these soft clips, these are designed for either end of the spectrum, either the low or the high. If something's getting jammed way up high, you like the look of it, but maybe the brights in one particular spot are getting a little too jammed up at the top, or the bottom is dropped below the visible light spectrum your eye can pick up. A simple way to sort of round those off is just grab that particular color band. You can see on the RGB, the blue is very jammed up to the top in the highest of highs. So I can grab the high soft, move it forward, and it'll slowly just roll that off and soften it so it's not quite so jammed. And you could do the same with the lows too. If I chose the red and said, oh, the low soft, I'd like to soften up some of the reds in the very bottom, you can see I can pull that up and it just softens it up a little bit. Just little tricks for slightly balancing some of the stuff that gets a little out of the visible spectrum or looks a little blown out. And if we play through this clip, it's kind of cool. It's getting a cool look to it, a little more moody, a little more evening-esque. One thing though, when I change the color grading, I can see that in some spots when he steps away from the window, his face gets a little bit darker than I'd like. So here's a great spot where I can bring in yet another power window and accentuate what I want the viewer to pay attention to. Let's do this. Let's right click. Let's add another node, another serial node. And in this one, this time, I'm going to add a circular power window. Now here's where you'll really start seeing what these power windows can do. If you notice, there's sort of all these rings that are going on around this circle. Like, why is there a square and there's another ring and another ring? There's like 3 rings and a square and dots everywhere. What the heck does that do? So let me quickly show you what each one of these things does. The square is just controlling the overall size of this window. So if you click on any one of these corner dots right here, and grab, left click and hold and pull outward or inward, it's just going to increase or decrease the size of the window or the size of the area that's going to be affected with whatever different color changes you make using this power window. These other ones that are sort of in the middle here on this circle, that's going to change the shape of the circle. So you can make it a little more oblong or a little taller. And then the ones on the outside, these red ones, those start controlling sort of the stretch of the effect. So if you wanted something really focused and have a really harsh line, you could pull that all the way in and it would just be that circle. And there would be a huge difference. If you notice, watch what happens. I'll turn up the gamma right here. It's like a mirror. It's a perfect circle of what's being affected. And it's got a harsh line. If you grab those other dots and pull outward, you can see it softens that whole effect. And the more you pull outward, the tighter that center dot gets, and it allows you to reconfigure, and you can pull outward again and sort of stretch that out so that you can control how much of your video footage the power window is actually affecting. In this case, I really just want to do his face. So I'm going to bring that way in. I'm going to bring this outer curve way in, and I'm going to bring that up sort of right onto his face. I'm going to stretch it out. I'm going to narrow that in a bit, and I want to rotate it so it really kind of is just paying attention to maybe the front of his face and a little bit ahead of it, right about there. Let's pull that feathering out just a tiny bit, but not too much. Somewhere in here, and let's test this out. Here's where the power windows get even cooler. He's moving in this clip, and the power window I've just put on there really only pays attention to the frame that I'm on. So I would like this power window to follow him as he moves around this clip. And the way to do that is to go over to this tracker section and just hit this forward and backward arrow and watch what happens in the preview window. It's now going to track his face and make sure it keeps up with his motion so that this different thing that we're going to do on his face, which is lighten it up, will always stay attached to his face and he doesn't sort of move away and it's lighting up something else that's in that position now. So here it'll track forward first, and then when it's done, what it's going to do is turn around and track the opposite direction from wherever I had the playhead. If you had it right at the beginning of the clip, it would only track forward, it would be done, and that would be it. Just so you do know, if I select on that node and I've got this window here, you can see that I've tracked it. Once I tracked it, that little tracking icon shows up next to it in that bar next to the window, showing that I've already tracked this, it's been tracked. If I turned on another one, it would show you it hasn't been tracked yet. Now you can invert that right here by clicking on it. You can see it does the opposite, flips it. And here I can actually deactivate that power window completely. I'm not deleting the node. I'm not shutting off the entire power grade. I'm just turning off that power window and it's showing what that thing did. It's a cool way to quickly check things and see if the things you're doing actually work for the color correction you're trying to get. Okay, so now it's tracked that. Let me reset this grade here and you can see this window. Now, once it's tracked, you can still move this around and it will follow that track. Let me show you. I can turn up the gain really high on his face. That's much too high. And I can move the center of this to be, I don't know, behind his head. But watch what happens when I play forward. That mask is going to follow the back of his head now because that's where I just said I wanted to move that to. So you can always move a mask and you can even retrack it if you think it's not doing what you want. But I'm going to undo that and put that right back where that was on his face. And right back in here somewhere, what I'd like to do is just brighten that up. I'm going to grab the gamma again, and I'm just going to bring that up a little. I want to make it feel like the light is coming through that window and hitting his face a little more than it seems to do in this clip. So again, gamma up just a little bit, maybe just the very top gain a tiny bit. And if I click away from that node, let's go back to the first one, you almost can't tell what I just did. It just looks natural. He's got a little more light on his face. And when I play this clip forward, you'll see that it really follows his face a bit. It's not crazy. It's not changing the whole footage, so suddenly his face is really bright when he's in the shadows. It just brought a little more light to his face as it tracks through. Now, that focus of the viewer is really brought to the thing that I want him to watch, the character in this particular clip. Now, you've noticed I put different power windows into different nodes so that I can control them. As I've said before, you can put more than one power window into a single node, but there's another thing here you want to pay attention to. It gives you like these 5 options, but if you wanted to add another one of these circle masks into this particular node, all you'd have to do is go up here where they're all listed and click on circle and it'll give you another. And you can just keep clicking and adding them as much as you want. Just keep in mind that whatever you do in that node is going to affect both windows. So if you have 2 circles, one here, we turn this one on, and you put it out here and you have, let's say, another circle and you move that one over here, and I'll turn all these other little windows off. I was clicking as we were talking. I've got 2 giant circles, right? So if I grabbed the offset, which is sort of like the overall exposure, and crank them up, notice that both of these sort of get bright at the same time because they're both happening in a single node. So you can put more than one window in a single node, but it's going to affect both of the power windows. Almost looks like I have a bit of a binocular effect going on here, right? If I wanted to do a binocular effect, I could do that and go, someone's looking at this guy through binoculars. Let me just reset that. This is the reason I really like using separate nodes to add in separate power windows. Tons of ability to slowly do things one at a time, add in each ingredient to your recipe as it goes. Now, what I've done here, you can see these are all serial nodes. That meant that every time I added a node, it took whatever was happening in the previous node and applied it there first, and then added this in line. You can also do this where it doesn't add the previous node first. You can do what they call a parallel node. Let me give you an example. I can grab this node right here and I can say add another node, but this time add a parallel node, and it'll add another node right next to it. Let me move these out of the way so you can kind of see what's happening. And you can see it's sort of added another node next to this one, the exposure. So it's sort of bypassing the exposure. We've taken the exposure out of the equation. It's still affecting the overall clip, but whatever I do to this node won't be affected by the exposure node because it's going around it. My node structure is getting a little weird here. If your node structure gets a little funny, here's a cool little trick. You can right click in the gray area here and you can say clean up node graph, and it'll actually sort of arrange them in a way that it thinks make a little more sense for you and a little more organized and in line. I don't particularly need this right here. That was just me goofing around, showing you can do it in parallel. But here you could do something like I could disconnect this exposure and I could maybe create a different exposure if I didn't want to change that one. Maybe I wanted to bring it up in a different way to have a different feel here somehow. And now I'll have a different exposure node and I don't have to lose the first one or lose any of that information. I can still come back and reattach that. And I can also stack them. I could have two of them happening at once, and now they're doing two things, like a double exposure. That's crazy. Let's get rid of that. Now, this is what we're looking at here. More of a moody cinematic feel to what's going on. And if I play them sort of back to back, let me see if you can spot what's going on here. Here's one side, the original, and here's the color corrected one that I did. Sort of changes the whole attitude of this shot. Much different than what was originally going on, which felt like middle of the day, some guy in his home or office looking out the window. Now we've created this sort of much moodier scenario where the idea of the guy being suspicious is really heightened and makes a little more sense, feels a little more cinematic. Now, if you want to learn more about how to edit your next YouTube video with DaVinci Resolve, make sure you click the video that I have on screen now or the ones that I'll link down below. Peace.